This is Darren Mar-Elia, VP of Products at Kerberos, and I'm joined by my colleague, Harel. Ran, say hi.
Hi, everyone.
Yep, and so just briefly on Kerberos, and I'll talk some more about it at the end of the presentation, but we are a identity protection and cyber resilience platform focused on Active Directory security and have been working in this space for a while now. And why we're talking about this now is we came up with, so there's a couple things that are kind of converging, and let me kind of set the stage for those. So, Active Directory in the past, and I'd say that this is increasingly changing, but it's often been ignored from a security perspective. That being said, it's become a key target for attackers. You can go back, 5, 6, 7 years now, and folks have been increasingly looking at Active Directory as a rich source of information from which to escalate privileges, move laterally, and compromise systems within an environment. We saw it most recently in the SolarWinds series of attacks, where at least part of the attack path in that SolarWinds was compromising privileged Active Directory identities and using those to move vertically into Azure and compromise resources in Azure. So, traditionally, the compromises were happening on-prem, and now we're seeing them happen both on-prem and up into the cloud to those resources that AD users have access to. And unfortunately, what we've also seen through our experiences is that many AD implementations have big holes in them. I talk about big enough to drive a truck through, but seriously, the majority of AD shops are sort of overwhelmed by the various paths that attackers are taking today, and those attacks are getting more sophisticated. You've got nation states that are coming after Active Directory and looking for paths to get privilege escalation and either launch ransomware or steal and exfiltrate data. Whatever the sort of mode of operation is, Active Directory is often ill-prepared in most organizations for those kinds of attacks. And as I mentioned here, it's increasingly being used to sort of move vertically into the cloud.
Yeah, so as Darren said, Active Directory is a very lucrative target. It's usually quite a complex beast. It's been around for ages. Organizations that I've set up years ago will usually find a lot of evidence of legacy stuff in there, right? Users, computers, old servers, things that were never cleaned up. And this is exactly what attackers look for. Right? So I've actually been a pen tester in a previous life about 15 years ago. And even back then, finding these things, finding an old computer whose password's never been changed, or a user with a little bit of elevated privileges that somebody forgot to change that was not in the monitored group, things like that. That's usually what attackers go for. And today we're seeing a lot of these being automated, a lot of tools out there like Mimikatz and other types of tools that attackers are using for their own purposes. All of these really create a situation where whenever an attacker is able to find a way in, they can usually, once inside, find something in Active Directory to take advantage of that will enable them either to gain persistence within the environment or to escalate their privileges so they can actually achieve their objectives, or just to move around the environment to continue to look what they're actually after. And I think in this presentation we'll discuss several types of attacks. Some of them are very advanced nation-state type attacks, and some of them are trivially simple, really that anybody can carry out, and it really runs the gamut. So whenever we see an engagement, whenever we talk to customers, even the ones that really put a lot of effort day after day in protecting their environment, they'll always have something there, right? That's why it's critical, as we'll continue to talk throughout the presentation, on looking at these things, having a process in place to continuously look at these things and really make sure that the environment is hygienic and it's continuously being looked after.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've done recently, which has been really exciting, we have a lot of folks in the organization that have been around the Active Directory world and the InfoSec world for a while, and we came up with this idea that the security vulnerability, if you want to call it that, or the configuration vulnerability of Active Directory from a security perspective, that knowledge needs to be democratized. It needs to be available to as many people as possible so that when they're managing their Active Directories, they have the tools necessary and the knowledge necessary to harden those. And as Rand said, to be able to continuously monitor against that. What we've done recently is we released a tool into the public domain called Purple Knight. And Rand, why don't you talk a little bit about the kind of the goals of Purple Knight and what we're trying to accomplish with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cymperis has been around for about 8 years, and really the top people who know and literally have written books about AD have been creating products that are installed to protect AD. But where we really saw an opportunity here was to take that knowledge and, as Darren said, democratize it, meaning make it available in a way that it's possible to be run anywhere without having to undergo the installation. And we learned a lot, right? We looked at hundreds of reports, and we saw a lot of commonalities, a lot of issues that occur throughout different industries, different sizes of AD implementations, from the dozens of users to the hundreds of thousands of users. And I think what we're going to present today is kind of the what we found to be most common across these various installations.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ron. And so what are some of those common weak spots? Well, the way Purple Knight is organized and the way we sort of think about this is around 5 different categories of kind of Active Directory security. So account security, meaning for individual accounts, users, groups, any security principles within Active Directory. What are the weaknesses that you see, whether they're passwords that haven't been rotated in a while, things like guest accounts or anonymous access, those kinds of basic account security hygiene behaviors. That's what we're looking for. And then account delegation. As you all know, that if you've been managing AD for a while, the Active Directory delegation model is incredibly rich. And with that richness comes lots of complexity. And with complexity comes the chance for sort of over-delegating privileges in various key parts of Active Directory. And I can't tell you how many ADs that I've visited on where the permissions that were meant to be constrained to a parent container ended up flowing down into child containers in ways that users weren't expecting. And that was just maybe due to lack of understanding of the security model, or just feeling like we need to solve a problem in the short term, so we're going to just over-grant access and worry about it later. And those are the kinds of worry about it later scenarios that attackers love to take advantage of. AD infrastructure security. So are there settings within the configuration of AD itself that leave you open to attack? Kerberos security. I've seen over maybe the past two, 3 years that the attacks and the tooling around Kerberos-based security have gotten more sophisticated. So there are a ton of ways to use Kerberos and abuse Kerberos in a typical AD environment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's an area where there are some things that you can do in your use of Kerberos to sort of make it more difficult for attackers to take advantage of that. And then finally, my favorite, good old group policy. I've seen lots of interesting, I've also written about lots of interesting group policy exploits or group policy-based takeovers by attackers in the wild once they get access to AD and are able to get in and edit GPOs or link GPOs where they want. Okay, so Rand, do you want to talk a little bit about these some of these risks? We're going to just kind of go through each category and talk about some risks and some suggested mitigations.
Right. So let's start out with password policies. We've been dealing with passwords for a long time now, and we're still not doing it right, apparently. Right. Some of the things that we're seeing around passwords, and this is true pretty much everywhere we go. Right. There's always going to be somewhere where there's an admin account that hasn't been changed for a year. Right. Some account that's falling out of the normal policy of changing passwords and password complexity. We'll see a lot of service accounts that have old passwords. That the system doesn't support changing the password and so on. MFA has been making a lot of headway now, and most places have some use of MFA, but it's usually not across the board, right? Especially when it comes to privileged accounts, actually. So we'll even see certain places where MFA might be deployed to most employees, but it's the actual administrators of certain systems that are not using MFA. And there could be many reasons for that. KRB, TGT passwords. This is a complex one. There's actually guidance on rotating these passwords, right? So changing the password, waiting for the change to be replicated, and then changing it again. That's actually, or not doing this is an exposure that can lead to a golden ticket attack, which is a very, very impactful attack, right? And of course, it's common to find, it's common to find several users whose password never expires, or even users who don't require passwords at all. So we see all of this, or some of these, usually wherever we go. An example of an attack that works on these kinds of exposures is something called password spray, right? So it used to be the common attack method on accounts used to be brute force, right? I'm gonna hit a certain username with all the passwords I can think of using a dictionary attack or some other form of attack until I get in. And we know how to overcome that, right? Whenever we see several unsuccessful logons, we'll just lock that account and raise an alert and so on. So now attackers are using password spray, right? So that's kind of what we call the low and slow method. It's about targeting a large number of users with a relatively small number of passwords, right? So I'm going to try maybe twice each user, maybe 3 times, then I'm going to wait for an hour, maybe I'll even wait a day, and then I'll try again. I'm going to use the most commonly used passwords, right? So password 1 with the @ sign instead of the A, with an exclamation mark instead of a 1. And usually in organizations where we have the password policy of 8 characters, 1 special character, 1 numeral, 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, usually the employees are going to get to a stage where they're going to start using that password 1 eventually, right? Once they exhaust their birthdays and their spouse's name, they're usually going to go for the common passwords, and eventually this will work, right? So there's a lot of mitigations out there. There's a lot of security systems that look for this. But it's very, very difficult to uncover these types of attacks without a lot of operational impact, without blocking a lot of users. So usually we'll see organizations, especially when it comes to AD, that will tune down their defenses when it comes to these types of detections. In cloud platforms, there's actually more opportunity for detection here. Microsoft rolled out their AI for looking across all of their tenants to uncover password spray attacks. But when it comes to an AD implementation, that's not something that's easy to do at all.
Yep, and I think you talked through password spray here. So, what are those mitigations? What do they look like? So in the kind of traditional on-prem world, there's been a lot of kind of differing and varying guidance around password policies. I know Microsoft and I think it was NIST came up with some password recommendations or password policy recommendations in the last couple of years that were different than what we had been told for many, many years. Questions around, how long passwords should be allowed to live, password complexity requirements, things like that, length of password. And I think part of that was based on the reality of user behavior and how how users respond to having to change their passwords frequently, and often respond by creating passwords where one character is different and that's it. And so if you know one base password, it becomes much easier to guess the next password that the user might have put in. So I think all of that is good progress, and obviously we're all trying to get to the world of passwordless, and that's useful as well. I think where we run into challenges with AD is around privileged accounts and service accounts, and not so much in the end users, but how do you ensure that these privileged accounts and these user account and the service accounts are being rotated frequently, and especially if they're privileged and service accounts, which is kind of the worst of all worlds. That a lot of applications, as Rand said, don't lend themselves to or aren't tolerant to password rotations. But if you have applications that are or can use group managed service accounts, which are Microsoft's response to this problem for service accounts, where they auto rotate their own passwords. If you have applications that are able to deal with group managed service accounts, then we highly recommend using those if you can. If you have one password policy for your regular users in Active Directory, that there's fine-grained password policy out there that allows you to set different password policies for other groups of users. And if you can use that for your privileged accounts to require either longer passwords or different rotation schemes, then I think that's worthwhile if you don't have other mechanisms to ensure that privileged accounts and service accounts are being securely managed. I think the worst case scenario here is that you have service accounts that haven't been rotated in 2, 3, 4 years. The problem with that is that likely 4 years ago, when that password was set, the urgency around complexity and the urgency around making passwords hard to brute force was not the same. And so if you have accounts that had, let's say, relatively simple passwords set many years ago, those are going to be, it's easy for an attacker with read access to Active Directory to find users with password last set not, very, very long ago, and then hone in on those, especially if they find that they're in privileged groups. So you have to keep thinking about how an attacker thinks about this, which is, I want to find the easiest path to get privilege escalation, and that's going to be the dirtiest objects that you have in your AD. And again, MFA for privileged users is really a must nowadays. There's lots of nice adaptive MFA features, conditional access, that makes the impact on these privileged users low, meaning that they're not getting prompted every single time if nothing is changing in their behavior. If they suddenly pop up on a continent that they've never logged into before, then that's when you want to MFA prompt them. But if not, they should be able to just go about and do their business. And I think it's gotten to the point now where this shouldn't be an impact on certainly privileged users, if not all users.
All right, so accounts with elevated privileges. So this is the one I like to call privilege creep, right? And I'm sure we've all seen this, right? A user is onboarded and initially they get just the privileges they need in a best case scenario, but then over time they're going to need access to another system. They're going to need just one-time access to some service or other, and that access stays there. This is true for users. This is true even for temporary accounts like vendors or part-time employees or things like that. Even service accounts for temporary applications or for installations or some other kind of work that's done and it's not cleaned up appropriately. Over time, these build up. And these are the sorts of things that attackers look for, and it's very difficult with the Active Directory permissions model to really monitor in depth all the different ACLs and all the different permissions for different users, and to really define in a good way what a privileged account actually is. Right. We all know about domain admins, and we all know about the well-defined privileged groups, but there are also privileged users that are lurking outside of these commonly monitored groups, and we see this everywhere. Probably one of the more famous examples of this, and this is actually not a direct attack on AD. This was on a Solaris platform. But if you recall from 2017, following the leak of NSA exploit tools by the Shadow Brokers group, one of the most impactful attacks that enabled was a vulnerability in Solaris that allowed escalation of privileges of pretty much any user on the platform to administrative right. And what that caused was that you'd have to go in and clean up the entire platform, because it was very difficult to tell which user that seemed to be normal actually had elevated privileges. Right. In this case, it was full root privilege. It was full admin privileges. In the case of Active Directory, it doesn't necessarily mean that you now have a domain admin. But just as an example, we'll also talk about later on in the slides, DC synchronization. Right. You could have, there's, I think, 3 different permissions that you need that can be granted to you even if you're not a domain admin. And you won't be part of the normal privileged groups, but if you have those privileges, you can now synchronize domain controllers, right? So you can pretty much start stealing password hashes, even leading up to golden ticket attacks. We'll talk about that later on, but that's just an example of a hidden admin, right? A shadow admin, and this goes for administrators for all types of services and applications in the environment. And it's really important to be able to first of all, define what a privileged user is, then be able to identify them and make sure they're being protected accordingly.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Rand. That privileged has different meanings in different environments, right? So, the low-hanging fruit is always domain admins or enterprise admins, and yes, attackers like to go for that because it makes their job easier. I mean, basically, at the end of the day, we're all kind of lazy and take the path of least resistance. I mean, even an attacker, they're going to find the shortest path to domain admin, because once they have that, then it's game over. But a more sophisticated attacker, a nation-state attacker, someone with a little bit more patience, is going to sit in an environment, look at the ways that privilege has been granted, and sometimes what privileged means is access to applications and data that are important to the company. If I have a database application that contains customer PII, then the administrator who's the administrator on that database application is a privileged user. They may not be a member of domain admins or any of the built-in traditional AD groups. They may be in some AD group that's irrelevant from a AD management perspective, but very interesting to an attacker. So you have to sort of think about privileged access across the various assets within your organization, and find not just members of domain admins, but the ability to find those hidden or shadow admins throughout the organization, and then ensure that they're securely managed and delegated. This is a key point here. And I think I talk about this in a subsequent slide, but if I have a low-level user who's a member of, let's say, the help desk, who has full control over one of these shadow admins, then that means a compromise of the low-level user equals a compromise of the shadow admin, and we'll talk more about that. But these it needs to be clear. A clear notion of what Microsoft used to call, and actually still calls, the tiering of admins, meaning that you have admins assigned to tiers that they're responsible for managing, and they don't cross those tiers. And from an AD delegation perspective, AD delegation doesn't facilitate crossing of the tiers. And that's actually more complex than it sounds, but it is an important part of this. And since we're on that topic, let's kind of dive in and talk about the risks around AD delegation. Rand, do you want to cover this? Or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll start. Right. So what we're talking about, AD delegation. You know, as Darren mentioned, first it's about understanding what belongs to who and who should have access to what, right? And then if we need to provide access to different users who would require that type of access, right? And we need to define what those sensitive objects are, and some of them are listed here, right?
Yeah, for sure. And you know, we can dive into some of these as needed, but I think the point here is that there are sometimes non-obvious places that you need to pay attention to. As you know, admin SD holder and the SD prop feature within Active Directory. This is this idea that, you know, certain protected groups have their ACLs periodically restamped with the ACL definitions that define on the admin SD holder container. So if somebody were to get a hold of the ability to write to that container, and particularly write permissions on that container, then they could change the effective ACLs on all protected groups, all groups that are protected by admin SD holder, which end up being objects that are marked with the attribute admin count equals 1. So that it's kind of into the weeds, but these are things you have to be aware of, because these kinds of changes, seemingly benign changes, if they're happening in your environment and you don't know why they're happening, or they're happening you know, by some user account that shouldn't make those changes, that's a big red flag. Same with the domain NC head. This is the domain object that you see in AD users and computers. It's the actual domain root object. If I have the ability to write to that object as an administrator, there's all kinds of nefarious things that I can grant access to. I can link GPOs. I can change the security permissions on that object and grant access to be able to sync Active Directory changes, as Rand was talking about, that DC sync capability. So this is, you know, extremely problematic. Same with GPO containers, or containers where GPOs are linked, especially those where GPOs are processed by domain controllers. And, you know, all of these are checks that we have in the Purple Knight tool that we're trying to sort of bubble up the ones that we see most frequently and most urgently. And then again, when I talk about cross-tier delegation, you know, your delegation model has to match your administrative model. You can't allow, you know, in the model of tiering, where tier 0 is domain controllers, tier 1 is servers, and tier 2 is workstations, you can't allow tier 2 admins to be able to manage tier 0 admins. That should never happen, and vice versa. So this notion of cross-tier delegation can lead to all sorts of trouble. And you know, tools like Bloodhound, which look for attack paths across your Active Directory environment, they love to see these kinds of permission delegation weaknesses. And it's just basically a roadmap for attackers to be able to move laterally and escalate privilege.
Right. So these are examples of attacks that are more on the advanced side. So your common ransomware attack will not utilize these types of attacks. These are more at the nation state or APT level. But the reason why I like talking about these is because I think they exemplify the type of impact that you can create once you are able to take advantage of AD to a certain extent, and then even lead to additional attacks, which we'll talk about later. Right, so DC Sync and DC Shadow are great examples of attacks that take advantage of the Directory Replication Service remote protocol. Right, this is a protocol that is designed for DCs to replicate and be able to have one unified directory services across the environment. Right now, if I'm an attacker and I'm able to create a situation where I have a user with the appropriate permissions, usually we think of domain admins, but it does not necessarily have to be a domain admin, right? For doing DC sync, I basically need rights to replicate directory changes. It's 3 specific permissions, which are usually not specifically monitored for, and you don't necessarily have to be part of the domains admin group. An admin will need to provide these permissions, but once that's done, we could potentially have a user with these specific permissions and then remain persistent in the environment that way. Once we have a user with those types of permissions, what we can actually do is create a rogue DC, right? So we can register a domain controller and start replicating to that domain controller, and actually use that to synchronize our very own DC, and then look at all the credentials on that DC and start breaking those credentials, right? And that's one of the paths that can then lead us to a KRB TGT hash. It can lead us to other administrative hashes or other user hashes. And once we have that ability, we can find a lot of different ways to move laterally throughout the environment and to persist throughout the environment. And then an even worse situation is when we're able to replicate that rogue DC back into the environment and actually inject our own users and our own backdoors into the environment. That's what's called the DC shadow attack, right? And once we've done that, we can then deregister the rogue DC, hide our tracks, and now we have a great backdoor within the environment for persistent access.
Yeah, and again, so I think I've talked mostly about this, but discovery is key here with delegation and the delegation complexity. And it's you sort of have to know what you're looking for. If you're going to just try to farm all of the ACLs across your AD in any decent sized environment, it's going to take a lot of time, and it's not going to provide much value. So you sort of have to keep targeted and focused. Focus on those sensitive objects. Take the least privilege approach. Enforce that admin tiering on the management of AD objects to ensure that not only can tier 2 admins not log into tier 1 servers or tier 0 domain controllers, but they can't manage tier 1 objects in AD or tier 0 objects in AD. So again, delegation is just it's a rat's nest, but you have to focus on the important things, and at least as a starting point, get those right first. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about Kerberos.
So Kerberos is complex, right? Securing Kerberos is difficult. It's
understanding Kerberos is difficult.
Yeah, understanding it is difficult. Securing it is difficult. But really, the impact of attacks on Kerberos can be incredibly impactful, right? And all of the attacks that we've seen on Kerberos, they usually start with credential theft, right? What we've been talking about pretty much throughout this presentation. Let's look just as an example of an attack, golden ticket, right? Golden ticket is a very impactful attack. The impact of having a golden ticket is pretty much being able to access any service that is protected by Kerberos, right? So an attacker that is able through DC sync or through another credential attack to achieve a situation where they're able to get the KRB TGT hash and able to decrypt it, are then able to mint themselves their own TGT, right? Which means that they show as having been authenticated by Kerberos, and once they present that to a domain controller, they pretty much get access to any service they want to. Right, that's why it's called a golden ticket. If also you have federated services to cloud applications, then this could also potentially provide access to all of those cloud applications, right? The golden SAML attack. So this is a very, very impactful attack, and Kerberos, by being a authentication mechanism that's pretty much used everywhere AD is used, that is very susceptible to these types of attacks.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen a lot in organizations is probably the number one cardinal sin with respect to Kerberos security is to define Kerberos delegation on a particular service account or machine account and use unconstrained delegation. And this screenshot sort of shows where in 80 users and computers you can look for. Actually, this is different, but on the delegation tab of a particular user account or computer account, you can set Kerberos to be completely unconstrained, meaning any Kerberos service can be accessed using this from a delegation perspective, or you can set it to be constrained to particular services, and that's what you want. You don't want to define unconstrained Kerberos delegation, because then if that account is compromised, then it has access to any Kerberized services on that machine. So you really want to be specific about what services can be delegated to. And then rotating of passwords on any Kerberized service accounts is a key. So if a service account has Kerberos SPNs defined on it for whatever reason, those passwords need to be rotated periodically, and avoiding defining service principal names on privileged accounts and or making privileged accounts ineligible for delegation. So explicitly saying that a privileged account can't be delegated to. That's for most privileged accounts, that should be the default, and that can help to reduce the kind of the wide volume of attacks that can happen against Kerberos. Okay, so let's move on to group policy. I guess I should probably talk about this. So, why abuse group policy? So I wrote a blog post like 4 or 5 years ago about group policy as a malware delivery vehicle. And it was based on some real world attacks where an attacker had compromised write permissions on a GPO that was widely linked. In other words, it was linked at the domain level so that all machines or users would process it. And they were able to inject a scheduled task that essentially launched a malware installation, ransomware installation. And so they used group policy to essentially distribute malware. It was a perfect use of group policy, because group policy is everywhere and it works really well. So what I've seen over the course of time is that there's a lot of things you can do with group policy. A lot of the weaknesses in most group policy implementations are based on weak delegation. Again, the ability for low privileged users to write to GPOs that are linked to broad swaths of your user or computer population is a bad idea. I like to follow the tiering model when it comes to group policy management. If I have a GPO that's applied to workstations, then only tier 2 admins on those workstations should be able to edit and link those GPOs, and similarly up the line with the other tiers. So weak delegation on critical GPOs and weak delegation on the linking of containers to GPOs those are all possible avenues for attack. And then there are some things that you have to be careful about. So we all know, or maybe we don't all know, but should know, that back in the day, GP preferences used to allow you to rotate administrator passwords on workstations and member servers. Sort of before Microsoft came out with the lapse tool, GP preferences had this capability. Unfortunately, the passwords that were defined were encrypted in sysvol, but they were encrypted with a key that was published in the Microsoft protocol documents. So anyone in the world could look at the key, and it was a fixed key for every possible GP preference implementation. So it quickly became apparent that with read access to sysvol, I could get this password and decrypt it fairly easily, and then I'd be admin on all your workstations, presuming you were using this feature. So there's a startling number of implementations out there where this is still set, and this has not been cleaned up. Now, that doesn't mean the passwords are still relevant. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But having it out there is a huge hole. And when I've watched discussions between pen testers about things that they start with, this is one of the areas that they start looking for first, because it's easy. Again, taking the path of least resistance. So here's an example where an attacker with credentials to write on the GP permissions, write on the GP link. They find a GPO that changes security, lowers security, adds a group to an administrator's group, and then they link it to wherever, whatever container they can write GP link permissions on. Let's say it's the domain. They link this GPO to the domain, and suddenly security postures changed across the entire environment because they had write permissions on the GP link attribute. And that's just one example of how you can kind of abuse group policy. And then this is, as I mentioned, this is the GP preferences one, where those passwords are encrypted in GPO, in Sysvol weekly. Everyone has read access to all GPOs by default. That's a whole nother story. And then they're able to get those passwords and crack them easily. So again, keep tight delegation on who can edit GPOs, especially GPOs linked to the containers processed by DCs. In another presentation I show how having write access to an AD site container that happens to contain a DC will allow me to escalate to domain admins in a very simple way. So keeping control over linking at the domain level, the domain controller's OU level, and the AD sites, and any AD sites that contain DCs. All of these containers I view as tier 0 containers, and then must be only editable by tier 0 admins. Monitor GPOs for changes, especially critical GPOs that deliver security settings. So make sure you know when GPOs are changing. A little bit about what we do. We have 2 products, Directory Services Protector, which is really focused on, if you think about what Purple Knight does on a kind of one-off basis, DSP, Directory Services Protector, is doing this against your environment on a continuous basis, alerting you when we have positive findings, giving you a historical tracking of it, giving you that letter grade of how you're doing on a continuous basis. And in addition to that kind of pre-attack monitoring, also being able to see changes as they're happening and let you either manually or auto-remediate those. So, really kind of taking care of keeping an eye on AD, watching changes as they're happening, giving you the ability to roll back individual changes. Could be operational reasons where you need to roll back a change. That's perfectly fine. But we also have the ability to roll back malicious changes. And then finally, if the worst happens, what you need more than anything is to be able to get back to your AD as quickly as possible. And for that, we have our Active Directory forest recovery solution, completely automated end-to-end, designed for this sort of clean restore approach to recovering Active Directory. We've separated out AD from the AD backups from the operating system backup, so you're not reintroducing malware that's embedded in your system state backups. We can recover to any hardware platform, really flexible and designed to, if any of you have read that 45-page miserable white paper that Microsoft has on forest recovery, you know that it's not for the faint of heart. And most shops that we talk to, when you ask them if they have an AD disaster recovery plan, they'll kind of sheepishly point to their system state backups and say, and that's it. And that's obviously only the first step of a very, very long journey to get back to a full forest recovery. So we've tried to take that process and essentially automate it. And hope this was useful. And come visit us at semperis.com to check out our products. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Rand.